Okay then, welcome back. We are going to be moving into written language. Now, I'm going to preface this video by saying that a lot of you already probably know a few written literary persuasive techniques, things like inclusive language, exclusive language, metaphor, simile, statistics, expert opinions, rhetorical questions, various appeals like to patriotism, family values, fairness, etc., etc. There are a truckload. I'm not going to define all of those. Certainly, you should never, ever, ever define any of those in your own writing. It achieves less than nothing. But what your goal should be is just identifying certain words and phrases in a written text that have a persuasive effect, quoting those, and then analyzing how that persuasive effect is generated, and also why. Now, you do not have to actually identify persuasive techniques by name. You certainly can if you wish, but if that's all you're doing, it's useless anyway. It's not what matters. It's not what gets you points. What gets you points is specifying where in the text that technique is used and analyzing how it generates a persuasive effect on the audience to get them on side of a particular issue. That is, if you're going by the VCAA exam descriptors. So, how do we analyze written language? What does that look like? Well, to show you how to do this effectively, we're going to use a sample piece of writing. Cool? So I'm going to use a sample from the 2017 English exam. So it's a couple years back, section C, obviously. I suggest you take a read of it online if you want better context for the samples and the analysis that is about to take place. A link to all of the past exams is included in the video description below. But the piece this sample is from, which has a responding second text in the exam, it's basically about a school policy implemented by the principal who announces the policy via a written update on their school website. And the policy works to reduce waste within the school. Now, I would recommend that you pause this video, you go away and you read and even perhaps annotate that particular text. If not, we're just going to keep going. So the opening section of that text is here. Dear parents of Spire Primary School, I write to you this week to introduce a new concept for all of us to think about. Oh no, I hear you say. She has got another idea. It is true that I often take this school down new paths, especially in areas that affect the preservation of our planet. We are the only local school that has a walk or pedal to school day once a week, rather than once a month or even once a term. We have 4 different bins for our waste products, not just 3. Our vegetable garden is truly organic, and our pet hens scratch and roam as they wish. But I think we at Spire can do more. We are responsible for the future of our world. Now, first of all, notice my highlights, which you should all be doing, not in reading time, since that generally isn't allowed, but in the few minutes planning time you make before beginning your writing. And yes, absolutely make time for your planning. Do not discount the value of planning and highlighting. Do not think that that is beneath you. Now, as you can see, the blue identifies audience. So as discussed in the previous video, make sure that everything comes back to audience. It won't always be as easy as this one, but make sure that your analysis is framed around what the author is trying to get the audience to think, act, or feel about a particular issue. Now, the yellow highlights are the persuasive techniques, or the words and phrases that I think have a persuasive effect. Now, I'm not going to use them all. I don't need to, and certainly there is no expectation that you implement all of the persuasive techniques in a written text. That's just not possible. Just select the ones that you think speak to the argument you've identified the most and use those. Now that brings me to my next point, and I want to make this very clear. Now, the sample deconstructions in this video are not, I repeat, they are not what the opening sentences of your body paragraphs should look like. They are the vegan patty of your body paragraphs. You cannot deconstruct the true persuasive value of a persuasive technique unless you can attribute it to an argument, which you will have identified in your opening sentence. And if you're watching this video, you either feel pretty confident about doing that already, or you've learned and revised how to do that from the relevant video in this series already. So I just want that to be clear. Okay, so for the purpose of this sample deconstruction and to give you a bit of context to this particular deconstruction, I'm going to quickly cycle through issue, contention, and argument. So the issue is wastage. The contention is that Spire Primary School is going to implement a policy to combat that wastage. And the argument for this deconstruction, the reason for that contention is that Spire Primary School has a responsibility to build its environmentally friendly practice. Cool? We got that so far? If you're not sure how I got to this point, go back and watch the video on identifying argument. If you've already seen it and you're still confused, well, maybe just watch it again to revise and clarify. Alternatively, it might just be that you need to practice it a little bit, so don't panic too much. But that's the argument. Spire Primary School has the responsibility to build its environmental practice. Now, granted, in an essay, you will have expressed that in a particular way in your topic sentence, but just to keep it simple, that's the argument. Now, once this is determined, I can more appropriately select the persuasive written language that I would like to analyze and then link that back to this argument. Now, if it's not linking to the argument, if it's not creating room for me to discuss how the author, or in this case, Principal Walker, is working to persuade the audience, which is Spire PS parents, then it has no relevance. I don't need it. And remember, we have to know who the audience is too, Spire PS parents, because our analysis of the persuasive techniques needs to be framed around these things. Now, the question that you should be asking yourself, because this is what the nature of your analysis should be, is how has the author used this particular persuasive device to influence the audience to concede to their argument? Now, those are the 3 A's, okay? Remember that. Analysis is comprised of the relationship between the 3 A's, author, argument, and audience. How is the persuasive device bridging a gap between these 3 things? Interpret the relationship between these 3 things and how persuasion specifically has been used to bridge the gap between these things, and that's your analysis. When you analyze a persuasive device, go to the 3 A's. If you're not linking to one, or ideally all 3 of those things, then what you're doing is not analyzing, at least not the kind that we're looking for. So we'll start with the analysis of one technique. Through her frequent use of the term we, Walker reiterates a sense of community between the parents and the school. With this sense of community firmly established, she then goes on to state that it is a community that is responsible for the future of our world. By invoking the environmental benefits for the future, Walker not only communicates to parents that they have both a shared interest and a shared responsibility in her policy, her vision for a greener future, and the green reputation in which she takes great pride, but so too does she highlight to parents how necessary her proposed policy is for the planet's well-being. So there you go. That is a high-level analysis of that one quote, or technically 2 if you're counting the we, but that's an easy one, and it's part of the same quote anyway. It's just broken into. Now, if you're thinking, how the hell did he get there? That sounds amazing. First of all, it's not. It's just doing its job. But if you're confused, we'll break that down. So let's look at it again. Through her frequent use of the term we, Walker reiterates a sense of community between the parents and the school. With this sense of community firmly established, she then goes on to state that it is a community that is responsible for the future of our world. By invoking the environmental benefits for the future, Walker not only communicates to parents that they have both a shared interest and a shared responsibility in her policy, her vision for a greener future, and the green reputation in which she takes great pride, but so too does she highlight to parents how necessary her proposed policy is for the planet's well-being. So remember, analysis is about the 3 A's, author, audience, and argument. When you're analyzing, you're linking to one or all of these things. So you got to ask yourself, how does the technique convey the author's meaning? How does it support the author's argument? How does it attempt to make the audience think, act, or feel? These are the questions that you need to be asking yourself. These are the questions that you need to be answering before what you write can be considered meaningful and relevant analysis. Now, again, you don't have to answer all of them all the time. Just make sure that by the end of a body paragraph, you've linked to all 3 at some point. Now, in this sample, I've color-coded those things. The persuasive written language, which I've quoted, is in yellow again. The author and the discussion of what the author is doing is in green. And the audience and any comments on how they are explicitly being positioned to think, act, or feel is in blue. Then we have the orange, which is the explicit analysis of how the material conveys meaning. And you'll notice the orange is always along those lines of what meaning is being communicated. Now, in this case, a sense of community is being generated. Environmental benefits are being invoked. A sense of urgency or necessity is being communicated for the planet's well-being. Now, this is what analysis looks like. It's a relationship between all of these things, which is why you're seeing the colors alternate. Is it hard? Hell yeah, it's hard. I don't expect that anyone would be able to do this right away. Certainly, that has seldom been the case in my experience with students. This is just an example of an end point. This is about building the skills so that you can reach and maybe even surpass a similar point. Yeah, this is what we're building towards. So the best things that you can do to facilitate your skill building are read lots of sample analyses, read lots of articles and practice doing it in your head, and practice sitting down and articulating, even if it's an unstructured mess. Just start putting yourself in a position to generate those thoughts. Organizing those thoughts that's future year's problem. We'll just take one step at a time. Now remember, when it comes to persuasive written language, it comes down to those same questions. How does the technique convey the author's meaning? How does it support the author's argument? How does it attempt to make the audience think, act, or feel? Now, sometimes those questions even mean the same thing. And if you find yourself in that situation, that's okay. There is no right or wrong. Just interpret these things based on your own judgment and make sure you quote and specify the evidence that has led to that particular interpretation. As long as the claims you are making are justified through the use of textual evidence, there is no wrong. There are only degrees of insight. Now, this is what the paper is asking you for. The paper is giving you a text, and the paper is saying to you, don't just repeat to me what the text says. I already know that. But tell me about the person who wrote that text. Tell me what their arguments were, how they constructed those arguments through persuasive language, and how they tried to get their audience on side. That's what the paper wants to know. So, as long as that's what you're doing, it doesn't matter what order you do that in. It doesn't matter how it's structured. What matters is your analysis. As long as you're doing that, you're doing your job. Prioritize that above structure, above whatever else you might have been taught that you're latching onto and trying to emulate, even when it confuses the hell out of you. This is the heart of the task. Tell me about this author or authors. Tell me how they used argument and persuasive language to convince their audience of their opinion. Structure will come more or less organically when you have a firm understanding of these things. Okay, so we'll do another one. Now, I'm going to use the second paragraph from the exam paper, okay? Now, the text reads, I've become increasingly concerned about the amount of superfluous packaging in our everyday lives. The newspaper in plastic, hamburgers in boxes, individual packets of tissues, little packages of rice crackers and chips. You might say that the material from which these containers are made are biodegradable or recyclable, but they still exist, are still clogging our bins and eventually our country. If we do not do something positive about this now, the environmental damage will be irreversible. So again, I've got my highlights. Again, I'm not going to use them all. And again, I'm only going to select the ones that best speak to the argument that I have identified. So for argument's sake, the argument being made here is that Walker is saying that littering is the reason, or is the argument, why immediate action is needed. Now again, you'll have expressed this in a particular way in the topic sentence. That's not the focus of this video. But that's the argument that will inform our selection and analysis of persuasive written language. So a piece of more sustained analysis to support this would be, not only does Walker reiterate that the environmental damage will be irreversible if her policy does not become a communal effort among the Spire community, but she illustrates to parents how this damage is already apparent. By itemizing the superfluous packaging she perceives around the school grounds, including newspaper and plastic, hamburgers and boxes, individual packets of tissues, little packages of rice crackers and chips, Walker imbues her policy with a sense of urgency. Her policy, therefore, transitions from being a provisional effort to protect the future to being a necessary measure taken in the present to avoid clogging our bins and eventually our country. So again, let's break that down because this one's a little bit different. So immediately you'll notice that this sample is a bit more sustained. It has more pieces of evidence, and that evidence is embedded into the analysis rather than being the kind of approach that's just one piece of evidence and analysis, another piece of evidence and another piece of analysis. So while it isn't wrong to do that, again, effective analysis is about looking at the relationship between persuasive techniques, between author and argument and audience. And so if you're doing it as effectively as possible, your structure will kind of look like it's in flux because it's bouncing between all of these different things. So again, persuasive written language is in yellow, author discussion is in green, and audience is in blue. And then we have the orange, which is the analysis of how the material conveys meaning. Now, in this case, showing that damage is happening now, generating a sense of urgency, again, and moving from a future problem to a present one. Now that shows me that there's an understanding about what the author has attempted to do and how they've attempted to do that. Now, in case that's still unclear, I'm going to try one more way of explaining this. Now, when we discussed identifying argument, we looked at the issue, contention, and argument. Now, one strategy was using the flowchart, the becauses, and the other was thinking of it in terms of the what, how, and why. Now, what is the topic? That's the issue. How does the author feel about it? That's the contention. And why do they feel this way? That's the argument. Now, you can actually recycle this pattern of thinking or apply it on a smaller scale to each individual argument, in which case you'd be asking yourself, what is the persuasive device? How does it convey meaning? And why has the author used it? Now, if you're thinking of it in that way, then the what is the persuasive device question is answered by quoting the thing and identifying it by name too, if you want to. Then the how does it convey meaning question is answered by looking at the persuasive effect it generates. Or how does it position the audience to think, act, or feel? That's the effect. It makes the audience think, act, or feel this by doing whatever it does. And then finally, the why has the author used it question, that's answered by linking back to the argument. To convince the reader of the argument, that is always the why. That's the only reason why people would use persuasion, to get someone on side. You just need to specify and frame all of those things around the argument that you have identified and are analyzing. Now again, the order is not important. What's important is just that you do them all. So the takeaway from this video in a nutshell are basically these two strategies about how to analyze persuasive techniques. These are the two models that you can use. So the first one is just looking at those questions. How does the technique convey the author's meaning? And then there's an example of a sentence starter there. How does it support the author's argument? And how does it attempt to make the audience think, act, or feel? If that one doesn't work for you, you can use the second strategy, which is just the what, how, and why. So what is the persuasive written language being used? How does it convey meaning, and why has the author used it? So again, there are kind of examples of sentence starters kind of in those brackets. You don't have to use them. They're just suggestions in case you get stuck. But basically, you can use either of these. They both end up doing the same thing anyway. But remember, you can be doing them all at the same time as well, in which case they might not necessarily need to be separate sentences. You just need to make sure that in every body paragraph, these are the questions you're answering, because this is where the analysis is. This is what shows an understanding of argument and written language. From there, it then just becomes a matter of how insightfully and how meaningfully you answered those questions. Okay, so that was a slog of a video, but it is the lion's share of your writing. But I hope that that clarifies just a little bit how to do that. Please drop a comment letting me know if this was helpful or if you're still stuck, and I'll see what I can do. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.